welcome back. I hope you're all happy after a very nice lunch. Our next speaker, to be absolutely honest, really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He is world-renowned, and I should say at this point, he will be taking questions, so get onto Slido now. And if you are asking a question from the floor, I think we've established by now that you have to make it really obvious, or I just don't see you. I'm beginning to wonder if maybe I need to look at my new glasses, so just make it really obvious. And when you do ask a question, if you can stand up and tell us who you are, that would be really helpful. So, our next speaker, he has been a government advisor. He's worked in big companies. He's written a book, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. And I'm really hoping that what he has witnessed over the past hour or so does not prompt a sequel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the director of the University of Nottingham's Food Systems Institute, Jack Bobo.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I normally like to start with low expectations, however, so that I can live up to them. It's been a really great day so far, and I'm excited to be here. I spent 13 years with the U.S. State Department in the United States, and I traveled to 50 or 60 countries around the world, and the first question I always got was, I thought we invited USDA. And so you probably thought you invited a Brit today, so I apologize. Hopefully you can understand the accent. I'm excited to be here for lots of reasons. You know, whenever I would travel, people would always say, well, what's the difference between what you do at the State Department and what they do at USDA? And I would say, well, that's easy. At USDA, they do things. At the State Department, we talk about doing things. So I'm here today to talk about the things that all of you are doing. Let me begin, though, by touching on some of the things that were said earlier today, because it's such an interesting conversation. I just arrived 3 months ago to launch this new research institute at the University of Nottingham. And I think there's sort of 4 things that I'm supposed to be doing. One is to be an ambassador for the science and the research that's happening there, to communicate. The second is to connect the research that's happening across the university so that we can scale the impact. And then finally, if we do those things, if we can do a better job with the money we get, hopefully we'll get more funding. And I mention that because I think that's the challenge of this new combined center, to communicate your story, to connect the research that's happening in order to scale the impact, and the money should follow. So I'm excited about the opportunity. So I want to, though, pull back a little bit and provide some of the global context for the conversation that we've been having about food and agriculture, because in many ways there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, yet there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge we all have is how to maintain and grow those benefits and reduce the negatives. If we were to be talking about land, 40% of all the land on Earth is currently being used by agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So there's nothing bigger than agriculture. If we were to talk about water, 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. You know this. The Colorado River, the 5th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these are not the challenges of 2050, these are the realities of today. If we were to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, 10 to 15% of emissions come from agriculture, another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. Together, that's almost a third of all of emissions. It's almost as much as energy and more than anything else. And yet, for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world. Positive rates of return. And I used to say at this point that the difference between agriculture and wind and solar is that for every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. That's no longer true. 10 years ago when I was saying that, it was, and yet things have improved so quickly that that statement no longer holds. That's the advancement of innovation. So I think you also know that we're going to go from having 8 billion people on the planet today to 9.5 to 10 billion people by 2050. Obviously, that's an enormous challenge in terms of additional people, but we also need to increase food production by 50 to 60% by 2050. Protein perhaps by as much as 100%. So as big as the challenge is today, it is only going to get bigger. And that's part of why this conversation is so critically important. Now, we also know, though, that 800 million people will go to bed today hungry. And that's obviously unacceptable in this world we have. 800 million people. And that's one of the reasons I think that people say that our food system is broken. As many as 9 million people die every year from hunger-related illnesses. That's 25,000 people today. That's 1,000 people over the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds. Mostly children. How do we get people to understand that those are not statistics, but they're people? That this work is critically important. How do we get people to care? So if, though, our food system is broken, it begs the question, when was it not broken? Was it better 10 years ago? 50 years ago? 100? I don't think so. So if we look at some of the data, though, today 10% of all the people on the planet are going to bed hungry. Totally unacceptable. 30 years ago, 20% of all the people on the planet were going to bed hungry. 60 years ago, 30% of all the people on the planet were going to bed hungry. If we were to talk about child mortality, the child mortality is about 5%, the child under 5. It's at its lowest point in all of human history, and that's because of better health and nutrition. So how we talk about this is critically important. If we were to look at some of the statistics in terms of what has innovation delivered in the UK, well, per capita CO2 emissions in the UK are at a 150-year low. 150-year low for per capita emissions. In terms of GDP, the UK's GDP is up 50% over 30 years ago, and CO2 emissions are down 50%. It is possible to have economic development and growth and to achieve our sustainability goals at exactly the same time. Global CO2 emissions per capita are at a 10-year low. So it's not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. So there was some talk earlier today about, we talk about robotics and all sorts of exciting things. Some people in the room probably won't raise their hand that they have an electric vehicle, but some of you do. And if you do, that battery in that car probably cost about $12,000. 30 years ago, to have a battery that held that same charge, $1 million. 30 years of advancement has taken a $1 million battery and put it into your car. That's the promise of agri-tech. It has not yet delivered in the last decade, but it needs to deliver. The world needs it to deliver. We hear a lot about deforestation, and deforestation is a critical problem that must be addressed, but deforestation rates peaked 30 years ago. Deforestation in a given year is actually half what it looks like because the amount of forests are expanding at about half the rate that they're declining. So forests are also increasing. So all of these things are important because in many ways, things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. Some statistics from the United States in terms of agricultural productivity. If you look at the resources necessary to produce a bushel of corn in the United States between 1980 and 2011, we produced that bushel of corn with 35% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than we did in 1980, 40% less land needed to produce that, 50% less water to produce that bushel, and 60% less erosion on that land. By every measure, we could do the same with cotton and canola and soy and others. Things are not just better, they're wildly better. But that's, of course, not the story that we often hear. We hear about the challenges, which are real, but they give an incorrect understanding of where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going. Because narratives are very important. The story we tell is critical to whether or not people think that agriculture is the problem to be solved or the solution to our problems. How we communicate matters. For most consumers, when they think of sustainability, they think that if we can use less water, less fertilizer, less insecticide, that's more sustainable. And it will certainly have a lower impact on that piece of land, but there is a reason that farmers use inputs, and that means that they produce more. And so I think of this in terms of local sustainability versus global sustainability. Local sustainability is about lowering the impact on that piece of land, but you will need more pieces of land. So the benefits are local, but the impacts are global. Global sustainability is about a more intensive use of agriculture, which may cause more soil erosion, may cause more eutrophication or other things. The impacts are local, but the benefits are global. We need less land in other places. It's really about trade-offs, that there will always be trade-offs between those two. But it's not about good or bad or right or wrong, it's about choices and consequences. How we think about this is important. The European Farm to Fork strategy is calling for reductions in fertilizers and pesticide use and moving more towards organic. And that's a choice, but it will also result in a 15% reduction in food production in Europe. That's a consequence. That means that Europe will be exporting its agricultural footprint. The country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil, so they're exporting their agricultural footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. That's a consequence. So how we talk about this matters, because sustainability is a journey, it's not a destination. Things are wildly better today than they were 40 years ago, and they will be wildly better 40 years from now than they are today. The challenge is to get to our 2070 goals by 2050. That's what we want to do. We want to accelerate the pace of uptake. Unfortunately, today, we sort of have two different visions of what our food system should look like. On one hand, we have a slow food movement that says we need to be producing our food the way we did 100 years ago, and we have this more intensive version of agriculture that says we need to be moving faster, faster, faster. And at the moment, they feel like they're moving in different directions. Our challenge is how to get them to come together and be just different ends of the sustainability spectrum where they're each providing a benefit. Innovation is important. I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there is no place people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together with friends and family, and if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. Consumers have never cared more, nor known less, how their food is produced. And that's also a challenge, because they care, so they're asking you to do things, but they may not understand the implications of the things they're asking for. And so that's part of the importance of communication that's been raised this morning. How do we ensure that the things they ask for are the things that they want so we can deliver the benefits they need? Because science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And so we need to ensure that the public is asking us to do the things that we need to do. So some of the things that I want to leave you with, though, are as we think about going from 8 to 9.5 or 10 billion people, that's obviously an enormous challenge. But how we think about it, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. I'm going to stop for a second. So that's a challenge. But we need to put into perspective where we've come from. If we were farming today with 1960s technology, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land to produce the food we do. That's more than a quarter of all the forest on the planet. So it's easy for the public to see a forest that was cut down and replaced with a livestock production or with a soybean field. It's hard to recognize that the forest only exists because of agricultural innovation, because it's the forests that aren't cut down are the result. It's possible at the same time for agriculture to be the single biggest driver of deforestation and the single biggest protector of forest. Those two things can be true at the same time. I'm excited about Agri-Tech and the work that's happening here as well as the University of Nottingham. I've had an opportunity to visit our Center for Dairy Science and Innovation that's connected to the work that you're doing here, investments, work on mastitis, reducing the harm that improves animal welfare, reduces cost, benefits the farmer, whether it's nutrition and animal feed that has the potential to create a more sustainable product. There's a lot of work that's happening, but I don't think the story is being told very well. I think there's a lot more that could be done. People need to appreciate the importance. And that's part of my job at the university, is to do a better job of creating a sense of community across the food sector, across the university. Because the chemists and the physicists that are working on ag tech related innovations don't necessarily see themselves as part of the food science or the agriculture school, but they should, because we all share the same mission of creating a more sustainable, nutritious, and equitable future. And it's much easier to communicate the importance of that research in physics or in robotics or in data science through that larger lens of how we're helping to create a more equitable future for all of us. How we communicate matters. So I want to come around to that point about going from 8 to 9.5 or 10 billion people. When we talk about the challenge, that's usually where it stops. How can we possibly produce 50% more food in order to get to this sustainable future? You know, we hear that a lot. What we don't talk much about is what happens after 2050. Well, the reality is that after 2050, population growth slows dramatically. We're adding 1 billion people every 12 years today. We're going to add 1 billion people every 25 or 30 years after 2050. So every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. Every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world. The challenge we have is not to produce more and more food forever. Things are just always going to get worse. The challenge we have is to get to 2050 without screwing things up. We need to get there without cutting down our forests and without draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Because if we do, we are good forever. After 2050, all the improvements in efficiency and in sustainability go not to creating more and more food, but to making all of that food production better. It will get easier. In 2100, we could farm the entire world organically and we could provide it, or we could take 25% of land out of productivity and return it to forest. We will have choices that we don't today. This is a huge opportunity. So one of the thoughts I want to leave you with is that the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they're the most important 30 years there will ever be. That's why this moment in time matters, and that's why the agri-tech sector needs to step up and deliver on its full potential. If the UK doesn't produce its food, it has the resources to buy it from someplace else. But almost every place else that will produce that food does it in a less sustainable way. So there are enormous benefits by producing it here. I was in Ireland last month, and they're talking about whether or not they should cull 20% of the livestock herd in Ireland in order to meet their sustainability goals. But if you reduce production in Ireland and demand remains the same, well, that just means you're going to import more from Brazil and Argentina. So emissions in Ireland go down and global emissions are dramatically worse. I don't think that's a net positive. So we need for things to advance here so that the rest of the world can benefit from those innovations. When we think about sustainability, a sustainable future, I think often we talk about a sustainable future as one in which there is an opportunity for future generations. And I think that's true. But we also forget that sustainability also means that we have a good life today for everyone. We shouldn't think of sustainability as that we need to sacrifice the present for the future. We need to invest in the present for the future. to create those opportunities. So I think that we need to figure out how to ensure that agri-tech in the UK doesn't fail, because if it fails here, you're actually failing for the world, because they need the successes here in order to reduce those costs in other places. And so, just to summarize, I'd say that some things to keep in mind are that things are not bad and getting worse, they are good and getting better, just not fast enough. Second, sustainability is a journey, it's not a destination. There will always be trade-offs. We need to recognize that and communicate it, because communication does matter. And then finally, the future of the planet depends on the decisions and choices that you're making. And I'm happy to be here in the UK to help with that. One of the first questions I got when I arrived is, why the UK? And my answer was, I want to change the planet. And it begins here. And so I'm happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The questions are coming in and fast, Jack. So, this is anonymous, similar to the significant advancements in production and practices of agricultural innovation, what are we seeing in the next generation of agricultural professionals?
Yeah, I think that the younger people are going to be very different in how they engage and think about technology than people today. I think that in terms of agri-tech and data and communication and all of those things they're just going to have been raised with it. And for us, having embedded technologies in our machinery is new and novel. For them, it's to be expected. I think I was talking to somebody earlier, and I think today we're talking about what can AI do for us. We will know we have arrived when we're no longer talking about it. And I think that for many of us, the young people are going to be not thinking about technology in the same way we do, because it's going to become part of their regular life.
Okay. Another anonymous, how can we engage farmers who don't believe climate change or sustainability is a real issue?
Yeah, so I've been talking to farmers in the United States and around the world for 20 years, and I think they all agree that we need to invest more in agriculture and that there are positive rates of return on those investments. I don't need to convince anybody that climate change is real to be able to agree that we need to invest in it. And I think too often we're focused on ensuring that somebody believes what we believe instead of does what we want them to do. I've worked with a lot of alternative protein companies, and I always tell the CEO, I say, look, most people will not buy your product because they believe what you believe. They will buy it in spite of it. Get out of your own way.
Okay. Another anonymous, why does this begin in the UK? Is it the smaller farm sizes so we can maybe potentially trial and bring to market earlier?
Well, I think there are a few answers. I mean, one is that there are great universities here in the UK, and they're doing an amazing research. I think where some of that's missing is getting that research out of the lab and into the field. Part of it is connecting that research across the university, because the research that's being done in biosciences should be informed by policy and regulatory understanding from somebody in another part of the university, so that they make sure that the easiest science may not be the best from a regulatory perspective. But I also think that the landscape and this scale in the UK is kind of what we would like it to be. I mean, in terms of hedgerows and how people are thinking about agriculture, and you're a lot closer to agriculture here in the UK. That mindset is where we want to be 50 years from now. And so I think you have a shorter distance to get to where we need to be.
Okay, Eve Metcalf-Tyrrell asks, should reducing crop or food waste, both at farm and consumer level, be a priority for food security?
Absolutely. I mean, a third of food is wasted, before it gets to the consumer in low and middle income countries. A third is lost post-consumer in most high income countries. That would be a huge benefit of reducing that food waste. I think sometimes we imagine, though, that if we reduce food waste, we are able to feed more people. But if we waste less, we buy less, and if we buy less, we produce less, right? And so it does help on the sustainability side, but it doesn't automatically translate into more people being fed.
How do we ensure that the net impact on global sustainability is minimalized rather than just local sustainability?
Yeah, so I think the diversity of the food system is part of its strength. And a lot of what we're trying to figure out is what are those places that can better accommodate a more intensive style of agriculture, and what are those places that really need that lighter touch? And that's where I think universities and government and others can help to map those landscapes in order to understand. And if it turns out that a landscape where it's currently intensively farmed would be better off in a less intensive system, then maybe we need to incentivize that farmer to make a transition.
I feel like I'm just a question feeder here, but crowdfunding thinks agrobotics is rock and roll. How do we engage financial institutions and big tech to think the same?
So that's in robotics. Yeah, I had a chance to talk to a couple of different people that are working on robotics, and I think it's super exciting. I think that consumers understand that, and we need the equivalent of the Boston robotics, where they're doing flips and somersaults and sort of things like that. I think that would work quite well on TikTok. I think that we need to show people what some of these opportunities are, but I also think that when we think about things like batteries, that the weight is going to come down, the charge is going to go up, and so cost is probably going to come down pretty dramatically in the next decade. And so what doesn't seem viable today is going to seem obvious 10 or 15 years from now.
Two questions that are sort of linked. You talked about getting research out of the lab and communicating. How do you do that? And also, how do we bring consumers on this journey? Who's doing it well?
Yeah, so I think that's part of my role. Not every research scientist wants to be on BBC or wants to be on a stage with the BBC, but I think that there are people who would love to do that, and so we need to do a better job of, one, giving them the opportunity and then preparing them for that opportunity. I think that science can be exciting. I was at the British Geological Survey on Tuesday, and they had fantastic presentations. Those scientists, they really rock, no pun intended. And their images and slides were fantastic. And it's like, I'm used to having really good slides, and I was like, wow, maybe I shouldn't have used my slides. So I think, recognizing the importance of being able to be a good communicator is really important. People like to learn things. They don't like to be told things. And so I think too often, we're trying to tell people stuff. Anybody who has kids knows that, when you try to tell somebody what to do, it's pretty much the surest way of getting them to do the opposite. So we need to lead more people to knowledge instead of beat them up with science.
Ben Williams asks, do you think we spend too long looking for that one simple thing when we need to shift our mindsets and efforts to work more at a systems level, embrace and engage with the complexity?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that the scientists and the people in this room were spending too much time looking for that one thing, but I think maybe governments were, and maybe the consumer has been looking for an answer when there's just going to be a diversity of answers. And so I think that movement to recognizing the importance of a systems approach creates more of an opportunity for a multitude of ideas to come to the fore. And so I think we're in a better environment for people to recognize that complexity.
Okay, if you could describe great values for farmers in 10 years' time, what would they be?
Well, I'm confident that they will be wildly more sustainable in 10 years than they are today. 20 years ago, there were things that people said that they would never do that are just commonplace today. I think change is hard. Change for most people is when somebody dies or loses their job, and I think those of us who love innovation forget that. And we need to meet people where they are and recognize that, people are living tough lives and they need a little bit more sort of kindness in how we approach them.
Jack, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Bobo.